Welcome to A Seat at the Table, where we are working towards redefining the representation of leadership when important conversations take place. Why is this important? Because when diverse bodies are not represented as thought leaders or decision makers, systemic imbalances end up resulting in insufficient or misguided solutions, from policy to products to education and beyond. While we live in a heterogeneous world, the challenge remains that the vast majority of seats occupied at the decision-making table to create, to hire, to approve are by and large still comprised of the same singular persona. And this becomes a bottleneck for problem solving. But we are optimistic for a new normal where diversity isn't about tolerance or a box to be checked. It's about recognition of the value that it brings to us all. A seat at the table until diversity is the norm.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to A Seat at the Table, where we are redefining representation at important conversations. Today's table talk discussion is about the bottlenecks of hiring for diversity.
It's not a circumstance where if you apply here, we will screen you out and you won't get an interview, or that you will come to an interview and leave it feeling disrespected or made to feel less than because folks were well-intentioned when you sat at the table, but said things or framed things in a way that made it seem like your presence there as a candidate who's competing for a job was really charity and not that you were a really well-qualified person. For me, I think it meant really trying to prove to folks that the Putnam Ave Upper School, or what would become the Putnam Ave Upper School, would be a safe space for them to work and a space that valued who they were. In conversations I had with folks who were veteran teachers, so not even talking about people who were green, but trying to get people to leave their spaces to come with us, it meant me sharing with them that, hey, there's an investment not just in you coming here to help us out, but in you as well. We do a lot of work in regards to creating opportunities to train folks for leadership. There are a lot of folks who come to us. There are a lot of Brown educators who come to us just for that, to work at our school, to learn what it means to be a leader, and to hope to be supported in their aspirations at some point in the future and being able to step out in that way. So I don't want to be too long-winded, but there had to be, for me, a comprehensive approach that said, hey, I'm not just putting out a job description and saying, people, please come. I need to go to the people and ensure that they know that this is a safe and welcoming space, because there may have been things that they've encountered in their lives that have communicated that certain industries, certain jobs, certain institutions are not welcoming of people who look like them or people who come from the cultural spaces that they did. And I knew the onus was on me to be the messenger that this place was going to be different. That we weren't just going to talk the talk and hope that you come in and trust us, but that we are going to step outside of our comfort zone and go to where the candidates are and let them know that we want to partner with you, not just to benefit us, but because we want to see you grow and flourish and be awesome. There's a colleague that I work with who actually does trainings for human resources on how you create job postings that use language that communicate that your job posting actually is one in which we are inviting, folks of diverse backgrounds, to apply, because there are small things sometimes even in the language we utilize when we talk about, an experience for employment that may convey to someone, hey, this might not be a safe space for me to work at, unless there's a personal connection I have with someone who says, they're going to give me a shot. Sometimes I'm pretty raw about my response to that. I usually am kind of jokey and say, hey, there are a lot of brown people who have student loans right now. If you've gone to undergrad in this country, you've gone to school with a lot of brown people. They're looking for jobs. They didn't just disappear after graduation day. So they are out there. The question or issue is, how are you connecting with them? If they submit resumes, are you unintentionally screening them out because someone has had a journey that looks different than what yours is, but unintentionally you are defaulting to looking for someone who has a journey that was similar to yours? So there's certain candidates that unintentionally, if you're not able to check for that bias or those blind spots, you unintentionally prioritize, which means that you unintentionally deprioritize other folks that you don't have in your circle or who don't reflect what your experience has been.
Is this similar in other areas like in tech, or got a couple folks in banking?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I'm working on, I just submitted a column for American Banker around the CEO, the Wells Fargo CEO's comments that he made, around there not being enough talent. And a lot of what Mirko was saying is what's reflected in the column, which is there's a network gap. It's not that talent doesn't exist. It's that the talent that exists is not known by the people who are hiring. And by not known, I don't only mean names, but I mean culture, right? Some of the translation that Mirko was talking about. But it also speaks to, are you a culture fit for these potential candidates? And, especially if you're a person of color and you're a hot commodity, you don't need to go to places where you are going to feel like a minority. There's no reason for you to do that. And so I think it's really important that rather than, CEOs or companies to think it's chasing windmills, it's really about closing that network gap for you, and you can start by, I always say the people of color who work for you, they're your best experts in what you need to change to be attractive to people of color. And if you give them a safe space, they'll tell you, it may need to be anonymous at first because they're not necessarily going to trust it. But, be ready for that loving and open and honest family critique, and so the last thing I'll say is that before you deconstruct this being an actual excuse, because that's really what it is, ask yourself, am I ready for that honest answer? Because for some folks, you may just want to keep doing what you're doing, because when you open the door for other candidates, if you're not ready to receive them, you're not going to retain the talent.
I'm curious to know your thoughts around creating that safe space retroactively. We were on a call with the bank the other day. Our DEI counsel was talking, and he said, look at the Zoom screen. You have a really long way to go. And I think the biggest bottleneck for me is it's my network, like you just said. I mean, I can go about hiring on my team, which we just did this. And instead of doing the same, okay, we're going through our network, through our tech channels, like broaden a bit, like Mirko was saying, like go to a different channel and create a short list. And we have an unbelievable short list now. And it was out of having conversations with leaders that understood that this is how we need to build it. Creating a safe space retroactively, how do companies go about that? And I've always pondered.
But that is a really important question because, first of all, safe space is subjective, right? And so I think at first you really want to be honest about safe space to what ends, right? So, when you're talking about trauma and healing, the people who need to feel safe are the people who have felt that trauma, right? And the people who feel uncomfortable are the power structure. Or the people who have inflicted that trauma. And I think, that's where it becomes difficult. But you really need folks in power to show that they're about deconstructing their power, and so it's not just enough to say, this is a confidential space, because, the minute the head of HR is sitting there, you ain't really got much to say, right? Like, except that everything's cool. I'm going to go back to work now. Thank you, sir. Right? Like, and you
especially in a Zoom meeting with like 400 other people on it.
Right. And so the first thing is that you don't create the safe space until you've created the context for the safe space. So, what I suggest for companies to do is to start doing conversations that allow for maybe even anonymous feedback, because that's going to be the safest thing. And it's going to allow you to see where your people are. And you may see people be like, this Black Lives Matter stuff stinks, cool. People are allowed to feel that way. You're not going to, you don't necessarily lean into it, right? But everyone has to be allowed to feel. And then you bring in experts. So I'm always rolling with, my white ally consultants and, my D&I consultants, because I want to create a space for white people to work through their fragility and their discomfort, because that's what's going to ruin a space quicker than anything else is going to be white fragility and us then needing to center around white discomfort. And because normally the white fragility and discomfort sits in the power structure, you got to circle up around it, right? Like it really does stop the flow. So, you help white folks or, whoever the power structure is feel comfortable about what it means to create safe space. Understand that if you're in a place of privilege and I'm asking for equity, I'm asking you to step down. And that also feels weird. But it's just really, really important that you do that pre-work, because you're going to be offering up a safe space that you can't hold. The last thing I will say is honesty is important in these safe spaces. So if someone says like, well, I don't understand why Black people can't just, like says something like that, that might make people feel uncomfortable, it's really important to handle the situation there. Call in, not call out, right? But work through that issue in a way that empowers the people who have been systemically ignored, and helps the power structure understand how get a new lens of looking at their implicit biases.
Some of my best friends and my mentors are male, and I have two of my kids are little boys, so very much surrounded by the male gender all the time, and have a lot of love for them. So, but at the same time, there's things that like my female friends and female colleagues have run into. There are certain things that certain initiatives that are done for women where, while I see the benefit and the purpose of them, I'm not necessarily like a big fan of it. It feels sort of like a separate issue, this whole like, separate, equal but separate sort of, kind of feeling to it. And then there's also that I don't necessarily, like I have my own experiences and my own points of view, and not everything that just because I'm a woman, I share the same views as every other woman in tech or other, male dominated environments. Is there another perspective or view on either of those 2 points to just kind of, throw a different perspective in this on, initiatives and what safe spaces mean? And do we all kind of hold the same view that, these initiatives and conversations in this manner are the way to go?
I've spoken to people from the African American community, and there's some that don't feel actually comfortable with the fact that every other single race that is not white, it's being included in the people of color like concept of name. So there's the people from the Caribbean, right? Like Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and then you have the Central Americans and South Americans. And even between the Hispanic communities, like, oh no, like we're not the same. So it's kind of, it's difficult, it's difficult to fit on just in one whole box, and then kind of have one voice and to represent that and look for equality when we're not able to support each other. And I don't know how everybody else feels about that, and especially the minorities being represented there. But at least that's a very interesting point that I see. So it's very, very difficult because we do not fit all in one box, and in order to kind of move forward with the movement, we've all been placed on that, on the same box, and not everybody agrees.
If I could just jump in for a second, I think, as an Afro-Latina, I was raised Puerto Rican, and you're right. This term, term Hispanic and Latino is also a conversation, right, around identity. And we have significant race problems, right? And we also have significant cross-country problems, right? Mexicans and Puerto Ricans aren't the same, but they were colonized by the same person or by the same country. And what your comment got me thinking of is, there may be different experiences, but the oppressor is the same. And I think that's the conversation that we want to have, that oppression ends up showing up in similar ways, right? So whether it's even in South America, and how it ends up looking there. Venezuela had a leader that was very similar to a leader we have here, right? Fascism ends up looking the same, whether, it's going out in Rwanda or, wherever, right? And that's the part that I think we want to hold on to, right? It's not that, your family gets put in cages and my family gets a knee on the neck. It's that it's the same person that's doing both of those things.
Exactly.
And if we can remember that power piece, I think we can come together with our own cultures and our own histories to find equity.
A lot of the problems that we've been talking about is people in tech are saying that there's a pipeline problem, that there's just not enough people to hire into the company in order to achieve our diversity goals. And this is something the big tech companies have been saying several years ago. They started to publish it. I ran a program at TripAdvisor where we would hire people directly out of school into product management roles. And they didn't have to have any product management experience. We were just looking for smart people who could come in. And one year, this was like 3 or 4 years into the program, we found there was I think 6 female participants in the program and 1 male. We hadn't even really taken stock of the statistics. And after about 5 years being at TripAdvisor, my product team at the company, in a group that is typically not very balanced from a gender standpoint, was 50% women and 50% men. And it wasn't necessarily that we set out to achieve some diversity goals. It was more that we took a different approach to bringing people into the organization. We took an approach that was focused on raw potential and how do we create an environment where people with raw potential can have the opportunity to move into a role that's really beneficial to the company and also helps them get the start of a really interesting career in tech. And so as part of that, we looked at people who didn't necessarily come from the same background. We also put into place really good learning programs so that when they came to TripAdvisor, there was an entire boot camp full of different learning opportunities so that people could quickly up their skills. And it wasn't necessarily because we were recruiting from different backgrounds. We just felt it was an important part of making people successful in the company. And so I think overall the tech industry needs to stop, passing the buck and claiming that there's a pipeline problem, and it needs to start looking at what it's looking for in a different way and actually create opportunities for people to come into the company. And I think one of the biggest things that we haven't talked about yet that's really advantageous in that is it will absolutely make you more successful as a company, because the people who are creating the products that people are using in their daily lives need to actually look like the people who are using those products in order to understand what problems to solve. And in the past, that hasn't happened. And I think it's created some situations that we're paying for today with products that aren't designed in a way that is aware of diversity and really savvy of the different needs that people have of products. And as and if companies start to recruit more diverse teams, I think they'll do a much better job about thinking about challenges ahead of time, solving for those things, and creating products that are beneficial to people of all backgrounds, and not myopically focused on 1 or 2 demographics that a product might be serving.
I think that's I think double clicking on that last point, I think that's huge. I think you also I think you have to determine a priori how important you actually believe diversity of viewpoints is going to be in the success or failure of the business that you build. I think for additional context, our businesses I would describe as is a tech-enabled business, and so it's definitely not. So it's not pure play software, and so the type of people we've hired, right? I think things would be much more monolithic, right? If it was exclusively engineers and product managers, and then there you have the sales force kind of divorced from the rest of the organizations. And I've actually noticed they just look fundamentally more diverse. For many of these businesses, there's no set of Medium articles you can read to make you successful on day one, because no one has ever really. It's still pretty nascent to build businesses in this way. We've already seen lots of diversity has been a major strategic advantage for us.
I think I want to name an elephant that I think has not been named on this call, and that's racism. racism is a thing, and it's not always a circumstance that people who are saying that they want to diversify their workforces like really want to do that. Please, I accept my apologies if I butcher your name, but I believe Malia mentioned this in the beginning when she talked about organizational culture. Do you have a culture that communicates it's okay for you to hire somebody that looks like me? Or if someone like me comes in, despite my qualifications, despite my expertise, do you really want me to conform to middle-class white culture? Is that something that you haven't even named, because everybody who works in your organization kind of shares the same cultural values? Bringing different folks in, use some of the same thinking that you do when you try to make sense of what are the cultural backgrounds of some of your clients, and how are you changing things in your practices to make it appealing so that they actually want to purchase your services or products? Can you apply that same thinking to folks who join your group? And if there is this assumption that our group is neutral and we don't have to think about that, then for me, that's evidence that there are blind spots and there's problems in that organizational culture. Because if the assumption is that we are just good and people should want to be with us and we don't have to take into consideration what our culture looks like or feels like, then we're privileging our culture as being the norm.
I mean, I couldn't agree more. And whenever I'm working with clients, the first thing I ask them is, why don't you have them to begin with, right? You're looking for Black people. Why don't you have Black people, right? Why are there no Black people at your company today? And the assumption that standards get lowered when diversity increases is based in white supremacy. And what I have actually found is that white people have not had to have the same competition. And so they actually are less talented. They may have the checklist, right? They went to an Ivy League school, but did they have to learn those things, right? And so what you actually see is that there's an untapped talent pool of people of color who are overqualified for the positions they have because of racism. And just a quick example, when I diversified Berkshire Bank's board and we brought on 2 African Americans, and they both were the only 2 Ivy Leaguers on the board. One was a deputy mayor of Newark. I mean, if you looked at their resume, one of the things that Richard Murata, the CEO, said is he was cracking up. He goes, this lets me know we're racist because they should already be on a corporate board. When you looked at their resume, so this idea of, I think we actually lower our standards when we don't let everyone compete. And if you actually want people who have the best standards, then get people who've had to compete in order to climb and not just fall upwards the way you can when you come from a privileged class.
So I think add in that I think oftentimes, and I've especially seen this in tech, diversity is treated as an input, whereas really diversity is an outcome. And so by talking about hiring, we're talking about the inputs into the system, but then the real accomplishment around diversity is not the inputs into the system, it's not getting hired in the first place, but actually looking at the trajectory of people who are in the organization and what their careers look like and whether or not that follows the same path. Am I really going to come into work every day and feel like I'm being evaluated equally? Or did I come into this position because someone somewhere was trying to hit a number? So that I think is really important. I think that's not a conversation that the industry is really having about diversity as an outcome. And you can see it in, a lot of the work that's been done around diversity has not impacted the senior leadership within organizations and not changed the trajectory of careers that people have within these organizations.
The diversity piece shouldn't be a warm and fuzzy charitable piece to it, but rather something that's very strategic that has, benefits, a multitude of benefits that has ripple effects both internally as well as externally. A lot of those can actually be tied to KPIs and success of businesses. And if you recognize that, instead of looking at it as a piece of tokenism that everyone has to have, then, I think that we could actually push, harder and have more viable outcomes. So if anybody wants to kind of add another soundbite or two, I do want to bring this to a close and then hopefully have another conversation at another time.
1000%. I couldn't have said it better. I think at the end of the day, I think the underlying question we have to ask ourselves is, and I think the only way you actually end up having diverse workforces and the type of world and places that I want to live in across a whole bunch of different spectrums, not just race, socioeconomic, right? The entire the running the gamut, education, whatever, is, do you actually believe multiple perspectives will lead to better outcome or not, right? And I also think a prerequisite to that, right, is you have to decide like the type of culture that you have. Is it a culture where you can have multiple different viewpoints and those can coexist internally within the same place? Because if that's not possible, right, then having multiple people with multiple different perspectives actually is a hindrance and very, very problematic. It's pretty simple. I think I've met people who I don't think they're definitely not looking for diversity for diversity's sake and some lovely end, but I think they really do believe, and I think that it is they if you know that they need to serve their customers, and that is a valuable viewpoint.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, everyone.